This is the Google Pixel 9 Pro XL, and this phone has made some drastic changes compared to its predecessor. Not only has the entire Pixel lineup been completely redesigned, it's got a new chipset and a whole bunch of new features specifically with AI, and while Google has got a lot right with these devices, there are still some areas where things feel a bit clunky and fall short in my opinion. I've been using the Pixel 9 Pro XL for the last week, testing out everything that I can, and today I want to dive into what that whole experience has been like, what I've really enjoyed, what's maybe not so great or maybe a bit gimmicky, and what I'd like to see improved. So if you're thinking of buying a Pixel, or maybe you're not sure if it's worth the upgrade, stick around and let's get into it. Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. Over the past few years, we've seen Google take some pretty big steps with their phones to differentiate themselves from other brands. I'd say that really started with the introduction of the Tensor chip in the Pixel 6, followed by a lot of AI stuff that we've seen over the last year or so. And while this generation builds off both of those, the biggest change in my opinion is the design. The Pixel 9 Pro series now has squared edges along the sides, with those sides having a glossy metal finish and a matte finish on the back. You also have a brand new camera bump on the back, which is probably the most distinctive design change and replaces the old camera visor. I honestly really like the camera bump a lot more than the visor. I know the visor was somewhat unique, but I always found it looked weird in a case, and the aluminum on last year's 8 Pro scratched really easily, which I don't think is going to be a problem this year. I also think that this looks unique in its own right, although it does have a striking resemblance to a Google Nest doorbell, but what I love about Pixel phones, unlike most phones like my iPhone or my Samsung S24 Ultra, is you can sit it flat on a desk and use it without it wobbling because the camera bump isn't sticking out and off to one side. Having the camera bump and the cameras themselves more towards the middle of the phone makes it a lot nicer for photos of close-up subjects. And in a general sense, I think it looks great, and most importantly, it is quite comfortable to hold. The right side of the phone still has the volume rocker that sits naturally where your thumb rests, with the power button just above that, which I've had to try and retrain my brain for. Because I've been using the iPhone and the S24 Ultra so much over the last year where the buttons are reversed, I'm still constantly hitting the volume buttons to lock the screen, and I'm sure I will get over that. But I do kind of wonder if it wouldn't make sense to have that switched anyway, as pressing the power button does open up Gemini, which is Google's big selling point that we're going to get into in a bit, but overall, I think Google really hit it out of the park with the design this year. The Pro models are still going to pick up fingerprints, especially on mine, which is black or obsidian as Google calls it. I've kind of preferred living dangerously and not using a case this year, but even with a case, it feels good. And I do think that the cases look a lot better this year, with having more of that squared off camera bump. Having a case will obviously make this a little bit heavier if that's of any concern, and weight-wise, the 9 Pro XL is the exact same as the iPhone 15 Pro Max at 221 grams, and is just a hair lighter than the S24 Ultra that's just over 230. So pretty much average for a flagship device with a larger screen, which is new this year as well. This year you have two Pro options. You can go with a Pixel 9 Pro that comes in at 6.3 inches and is a touch lighter, or you can get the Pixel 9 Pro XL, which moves up to 6.8 inches and is just a hair bigger than last year's Pro. I'd be perfectly fine with either of these, but I went with the Pro XL because I wanted something as close to my S24 Ultra as possible, more so I could do an accurate comparison between the two. But you do have other advantages like a bigger battery, which we'll get into in a bit, but just strictly speaking to the screen, this looks fantastic. Like I said, it's a 6.8 inch 120Hz OLED screen with a 1344 by 2992 resolution and can potentially go all the way up to 3000 nits peak brightness, which is up from 2400 last year. Placed side by side with the S24 Ultra and the iPhone 15 Pro, I do find it to be the brightest out of the bunch, and the overall picture is outstanding. Watching any media on here looks great, and with the 120Hz refresh rate, everything is super smooth. both with watching higher refresh rate content and moving around the UI. Google has done a really good job with transitions and animations in the last couple of years that make everything feel fluid and responsive, especially with the haptics in here, which in my opinion are the best out of any Android phone. The feedback and vibration all feel realistic and tactile without it feeling like it's just your phone vibrating, and the general responsiveness should be even better this year with the introduction of something called adaptive touch. This is essentially supposed to improve touch sensitivity, where if you have wet fingers or you have a screen protector on, the phone will adjust for those things. I'm not using a screen protector, at least not yet, but I have noticed it does seem to be a bit more accurate with wet fingers as opposed to other devices, but that's a bit of a wait and see for me. There's also a new in-display fingerprint sensor this year, going from an optical reader that was in the 8 Pro to an ultrasonic version in the 9 Pro and the Pro XL. That's a lot quicker and more accurate, and I haven't had any issues with it. The one thing that I wish the display had was a little bit better anti-reflective coating, as it's not quite as strong as other models, but all in all, that's really my only complaint. Now, internally, that's a bit of a different story, and my main issue here isn't necessarily the performance, but what you get for the cost. The Pro-level pixels with a larger screen jumped from $999 USD last year to $1099 this year, which is what this particular model that I have costs. This has 16 gigs of RAM, which is great, but it runs the Tensor G4 chip that benchmarks significantly worse than most flagship phones, and it only has 128 gigs of storage running on UFS 3.1 instead of UFS 4, meaning that the speed of the storage is slower than a lot of premium phones. Are you going to notice that in real-world use? Probably not for most things, but I do think that it is worth noting that at the time of filming this, you can get an S24 Ultra with 256 gigs of storage for around the same price, or something like the OnePlus 12 for considerably cheaper, both of which do have better performance on paper. Again, it's not something that you're likely gonna notice as a casual user, and there's a lot of other things to consider like the general experience and features, which are gonna be different for every model. But if you equate price directly with things like specs, I think it is worth mentioning. As far as performance goes with my own use, I haven't felt any lag whatsoever, and the Pixel 9 Pro XL has stayed much cooler under load than my 8 Pro did. In games, it will occasionally heat up a little bit, and resource-heavy apps like Lightroom, or if I'm recording a lot of video or something, but overall, I don't really feel like I'm missing out anywhere having a bit less power than usual. Gaming has been super smooth in the tests that I've ran, and I haven't had any problems with app crashes or slowness, and any social apps run fine, with photo and video uploads showing absolutely no display or color issues. Speaking of photos and video, the rear cameras haven't really changed a whole lot from last year. The main camera sensor is 50 megapixels, the telephoto is 48 and has the exact same specs, while the ultra-wide differs just a touch with an f1.7 aperture versus 1.95 last year, and I believe just has a hair narrower field of view this year, but it's not really perceivable. In contrast to that, the front-facing camera has improved dramatically, going from a 10.5 megapixel sensor in the 8 Pro to 42 megapixels this year, and is leaps and bounds better. That being said, I mostly just stick to the rear cameras, and I think I prefer the photos coming off the Pixel over both the S24 Ultra and the iPhone 15 Pro, as they just feel or look a little bit more natural. You're still going to get computational photography that processes the image for things like the sky and dynamic range, but I find that it doesn't flatten out a photo in the same way those other models do, and the shadows actually look like shadows in a lot of photos. On the other hand, it can sometimes struggle in portrait mode with successfully cutting out a subject from the background, and the transition between lenses can still be pretty janky or jarring, which is something that I mentioned last year that was present in the 8 Pro. The weird part is that transition seems to be different between photo and video options, and neither are very good, but the way that it moves around and focuses between each mode feels very different, which just feels off. Other people have reported similar things where the viewport seems to tilt between lenses, so it's definitely something to keep an eye on. I suspect that might be a software issue, and hopefully we see an update for that at some point, because I do find that to be annoying, especially if you're recording video. On the video side of things, Google says that you can record 8K video via Video Boost, which really just upscales video to 8K from 4K and seems to be hit or miss depending on the conditions. You really need good lighting, and too many textures within a video can make things look weird, but a standard video recorded in 4K from what I've seen so far looks great. In daylight, all the video that I've taken has looked clean and the stabilization is fantastic. With lower light scenarios, it does introduce a bit of noise, and the electronic stabilization will make things look pretty janky with sudden movements, which is pretty common on phones, but you notice it here more than the S24 Ultra or the iPhone 15 Pro. You'll also notice that within the camera app, you've got a new photo type called Add Me, where whoever is taking a photo can then pass off the phone to someone else, where they can then snap another image and it'll stitch the two together. This looks great at a glance, but if you zoom in, things can start to look a little bit weird, but it's definitely good enough for things like social posts. And outside of that, there are a couple of other new AI features with photos, and I want to focus on the ones within the Magic Editor. Within here, you've got the new auto frame feature where your photo will be analyzed and you'll get a few different options for generated compositions of your photo. And the biggest feature in here, and probably the most controversial, is Reimagine, where you can select an area within the image and hit Reimagine and add a prompt to insert something into the image. I don't really want to get into the ethics surrounding this, but I will say that I do think that we need better guardrails as this tech gets better, just so the generated images are embedded with something other than metadata, which I believe Google is developing with SynthID, but to my knowledge, that is only used in the Pixel Studio app and is currently not within the Photos app. That's a topic for another video, but the results here are usually hit or miss, and I often find they just don't really fit within the image. If I'm being honest, since all these types of AI photo features started to come out over the last year or so, I've barely used any of them. Same goes for Pixel Studio, which is a standalone app where you can generate all kinds of images. This might be useful for idea generation or just grabbing a quick image for a presentation, but I don't find the generation nearly as good as something like Midjourney, and I just say that all this stuff is sort of gimmicky. The new Screenshots app is kind of the same story, where it collects your screenshots, but the search hasn't been great for me, and there's not a whole lot that I can do with it personally. But things get a little more interesting when we get into Gemini, which, if you're not familiar with it, is essentially like Google's version of ChatGPT. Gemini Assistant is now the default assistant on the new Pixel phones, and again, is really hit or miss. It's much better than the old Google Assistant at understanding spoken word, say if you correct yourself mid-sentence, and with context, say if I ask it one question and follow up with another. It generally knows what I'm talking about, and is quite helpful if you're just looking for information. The part that I struggle with is it feels quite detached from doing anything on device outside of a few select commands like setting timers, but I'm not able to set reminders, and I can't do things like play a song from Spotify yet, or pull up anything like native settings, which is kind of disappointing, at least right now. I think I almost would have preferred if they would have worked on that aspect first and left things like web queries inside of a separate app somewhere, and I'm sure all of this stuff will improve. Just right now, a lot of these AI features feel a bit disconnected. When you set aside that AI stuff though, the software experience is pretty impressive. You get Android 14 with 7 years of software updates, and I much prefer the stock UI on here to something like Samsung's One UI. Like I said before, the animations and transitions really enhance the overall experience, and I even like the sound effects that Google chooses with the software for different actions and notifications. When you package all of that up, everything just feels incredibly polished, and I think just strictly looking at the phone outside of the AI stuff, there isn't a whole lot to dislike here. Wireless connectivity has been outstanding. Wi-Fi speeds have been some of the best that I've tested on any phone. I'm on Wi-Fi 6E, but this is Wi-Fi 7 compatible if that's something that you're looking for, and the Pixel 9 Pro also has Bluetooth 5.3, so it's not 5.4 like some other recent devices, but range is really good, and I haven't had any drops or issues there. 5G signal has been about on par with my other devices, but the battery life is one area where the Pixel 9 Pro XL was really improved in my opinion. The Pro XL has a 5060 mAh battery that is noticeably better than the last generation, and you can get through a full day of use on here no problem, even with the screen brightness cranked up quite a bit. I would say that I can get around 6 to 7 hours of screen on time with the brightness turned up quite a bit, and it does suck back the battery a lot more if you're doing anything resource intensive like gaming, but I would say it feels quite similar to the S24 Ultra. It does lack a little bit on the charging side of things, where it tops out at a max of 37 watts wired, but you can still get around 65% battery life in 30 minutes or so, or from 0 to 100 in just under an hour and a half, which is still fairly quick. If you're charging wirelessly, that drops to 23 watts with a Pixel stand or 12 without. So it's definitely not the fastest, and I would have appreciated Qi 2 support so that I could use magnetic chargers, but that's a pretty minor thing. All in all, I think the Pixel 9 Pro XL is a fantastic device, and just the way that it feels and the general experience really has me considering replacing my S24 Ultra as my daily Android device. I know I didn't get to touch on absolutely everything with this phone today, so if there's anything that I missed that you'd like to know about, please drop a comment down below, but that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to hit that like button. If you want to see more tech-related content or create an AI chatbot that comes up with conspiracy theories about why socks go missing in the laundry, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.